It is also my privilege today to welcome Ambassador Daniel Mulhall to be the interviewer and make some remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to be here. I've spoken at book festivals at Edinburgh, and at Newbury, and at Oxford during my time as ambassador in London. But all of them required people to pay significant sums of money to come to a book event, so 12, 15 pounds on average. And it's fantastic, and I want to pay a warm tribute to the Library of Congress and to all of its sponsors for being able to make this a free event. It's a fantastic gesture, and they deserve great credit for it. So it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Caoilinn Hughes. Now, we were going to have a long discussion about how to pronounce Caoilinn's name. Like, you know, Saoirse Ronan, the actress, she does it. She went on Saturday Night Live and she explained to people how to say Saoirse. I would have said Caoilinn because that's what my dialect of Irish would say. But
when you come across a real Republican, they say that anyway. You say it's Caoilinn, they go, yes, Caoilinn.
That's right, Caoilinn. Anyway, we won't get into that. But
no accusations.
But it's Caoilinn Hughes. You know, I came across Caoilinn's work in an unusual way, perhaps. I've been tweeting poetry daily on my Twitter account. Every morning I tweet some Irish poetry. Been doing it now for 5 years. And about a year ago, I started to worry that my poetry tweets were essentially a dead poets society, or at least a dead or elderly poets society. So I asked my colleague, Lillian Farrell, our cultural officer, if she could find me some young Irish poets. And Caoilinn was one of the poets that I started tweeting. And then, very kindly, Caoilinn sent me a copy of her novel. This is actually the Irish, British, European publication. The American version is here, published last year. Now, I think when I read her poetry, I thought, this is great, because here I'm hearing the voice of a younger generation of Irish writer. And I thought that she had a vigorous voice. And in fact, if you go on to my Twitter account, this morning, I tweeted some lines from Caoilinn's book, Gathering Evidence, which was published in 2014 and won some very prestigious poetry prizes. Now, this novel has been very well received. It had a positive review in The New Yorker, which is no small achievement, where it was described as, and I quote, a winning debut novel. And then the Irish Times called it ambitious, full-bodied, and fresh. And they went on to say, Hughes trains her unique gaze, her artistic, analytical, and emotional intelligence on us, not just in Ireland, but our capitalist world and the personal, political, and social ramifications implicit in our acquiescence to, or indeed championing of, its values. So Caoilinn is part of a new generation of Irish writers, very different from their predecessors. 100 years ago, when W.B. Yeats, the great Irish poet, was accepting his Nobel Prize, he talked about what he called a stir of thought in the late 19th century, which helped to create an independent Ireland and Ireland's stellar 20th century literature. So he said there was something happened in the 1890s in Ireland that caused an upsurge of nationalist activity in Ireland and of literary creativity epitomised by Yeats and James Joyce and Sean O'Casey and so forth. So the question I suppose I want to ask you, Caoilinn, is what drives 21st century Irish writing? What is the equivalent for you of that stir of thought that Yeats talked about? Is it the Celtic Tiger and the adversities that we suffered economically 10 years ago or so? What was the spur for you to write this novel about contemporary Ireland?
Well, one of the things that Yeats says is that your quarrel should be with the self and not the world. So I suppose that that is a timeless kind of ambition of any work of art. But in terms of writing in the 21st century specifically, I suppose the realities of Ireland and all developed countries in the last couple of decades have shifted quite a ways from our parents' generation, just on basic pragmatic.
Like me.
Basic levels of what you can kind of expect from a government, what your civic duty is, what the social contract is, education and housing and healthcare are all 3 times more expensive than they were for my parents. My parents, when they bought a house, it cost 18 months their salary. For me, it cost 11 times my salary. So there's just huge differences in your negotiation with being a citizen. And then I suppose if you're writing a novel that's set in that era, it's going to be grappling with some of those issues of what it is to exist in that time period, So, yeah.
So, just to explain to the audience, Ireland went through an enormous economic boom between 1995 and 2007, which was called the Celtic Tiger. We didn't invent that name, but that's what was ascribed to it. And then we had this economic setback, this economic crash, which of course you had here in America as well. It wasn't just an Irish phenomenon, but it does seem to have had an impact on Ireland, and your characters are very definitely shaped by those experiences. The whole story is really wrapped up in that period between 2008 and 2011 when things sort of fell apart, to use again a few words from Yeats. Although I have to say, as ambassador, of course, it's my duty to say that in the last 5 years we've had the fastest growing economy in Europe, but that's only a small thing. It's got nothing to do with literature. That's our subject today. But so, do you think you could write a historical novel?
I don't know that I would want to. I say that, and I might change my mind, but one of my favorite novels is E.L. Doctorow's Ragtime. So I say that, not disparaging the genre, but I don't feel any kind of urge to spend time doing research, and partly that's I'm a horrendous procrastinator. So if I give myself any excuse not to just write, but there are so many things. This is such a complex and rapidly changing age that I'm more interested in writing about the last 20 years, not just because it's my own more than 20 years unfortunately, my own lifetime, but because it seems so vital to try and understand what's going on. Shall I maybe explain the title?
Yes, please do.
So this book is called Orchid and the Wasp, and it's just an access point into describing the novel to talk about the title. There's a type of orchid in Western Australia that resembles a wasp. It has the structure of a wasp, and it emits a female wasp pheromone. So when male wasps fly by the flower, they try and mate with it. And in the process, they get the pollen latched to their foreheads in these kind of long orange shoots. And you can see the videos, the wasps are trying to get rid of something. There's no something's on them, but eventually they give up in frustration and fly off. And then they're lured by another orchid. And when they try and mate with that, they pollinate the orchid. So that's quite an unusual dynamic in nature. It's called commensalism, normally a mutualistic system. You'll have a little deer a bird that sits on a deer's back eating ticks from the deer. There's something kind of mutualistic. So this example of the orchid that mimics the wasp is an anomaly, or it's much rarer in nature than it is in society to have an exploitative system. So there aren't any flowers or insects in the novel, but it's kind of a bit of an anchor for looking at an exploitative dynamic. And there's an underlying question with the title, is it really loss if the loser isn't aware of what they're losing? So one of the things that were in my head, one of the little points on the constellation that goes into writing a novel was the LIBOR scandal, and that was unfolding in 2011 in the UK. The London interbank offered rate. It was a manipulation of the interest rate between banks in order to make banks look creditworthy or to benefit from the trades. And this, several people have been incarcerated as a result of the LIBOR scandal, which was outed, and billions of euro have been paid in fines. So, but people on the whole, it affected such vast sums of money. But people on the street couldn't really tell you what LIBOR is, or what this LIBOR scandal was, or which banks were involved, or, more importantly, to what extent their own money had been affected. Whereas in contrast with the housing crisis of 2008, which was a large part of the economic struggles in Ireland, we had also this subprime mortgage extravaganza. People kind of understood or seemed to understand vaguely what had gone on, even if it was at such a simple level of bankers being bankers, or even in Ireland, I do think people were contending with it, that they had some responsibility themselves. The taxi driver who had 13 million euro worth in mortgages, because the bank kept telling him, just remortgage the properties that you have, they're going up 20% year on year, you'd be daft not to. And so there was such an obsession with the very reality that capital breeds capital, and that the percentage return on capital at the moment is higher than the percentage return on income, which means that if you own capital, you're destined to be richer than if you work. And so this is a heinous and important aspect of the moment that we're in. And so it was interesting to me why people chose to try and understand the subprime mortgage crisis and the bailout and all of that, but they didn't. It didn't really seem to be so important to understand, an equally enormous, reprehensible act that was going on. And so I was interested in that. To what extent is it less of a crime if we don't know that it's really happened, or we can't tell you what's been done specifically? So it's essentially, trying to engage your own complicity if you are not trying to educate yourself about the realities of how we've wound up in a moment where you can work 9 until 9 every day, and the guy who was born into a bit of land or any other form of capital is going to be better off.
But of course, that experience is one that has affected a lot of countries, and it's had, I would say, seismic political effects. But you're, of course, in this book, you're really looking at its effects on one family, essentially, and their circle, and in particular, your heroine, if I can call her that, Gail Foss. So, were you trying to, by looking at this extraordinary character you've created, were you trying to understand the broader issues that have been occupying the headlines of newspapers and radio stations and TV talk shows all over the world for the last 10 years? And we've seen, Brexit in Europe, we've seen things happening in this country that wouldn't have been maybe happened before. And it all seems to be a product of this period in history that you have looked into through the person, or through the people that you focus on in your novel, the Foss family.
Yeah, so I think still people don't necessarily, there's still so much to be done in terms of your everyday person's understanding of the situation that we're in.
Yeah.
I mean, 6 people in America, the heirs of the Walmart empire, own more wealth than the lowest 30% of American society. Does every person in the room know how that happened or how that's possible? Does every person in the room know that last year the Trump administration introduced a tax cut whereby if you buy a private jet, it's write-offable? Which is a threefold, crime. But in terms of oil and the environment, and so there's still kind of just because there is more coverage and more kind of engagement and more civic action in the public doesn't necessarily mean that we're anywhere close to where we need to be in order to really to contend with it, and to not be manipulated still by bankers and.
And do you think that this situation that has captured so much attention over the last 10 years. I mean, the number of books written about the crash and its implications and so on. I mean, both, well, mainly, I suppose, non-fiction, political, economic, sociological studies. But do you think that particular period, that particular crisis, could provide you with material for a number of novels. I mean, is this
Oh,
going
yeah.
to be your, your special subject? Like,
I mean, well, I have another novel coming out next year. There's so many things already that I haven't addressed from your questions. My brain's a little bit firing off.
Sorry for my questions. They should be said.
No, but I think I'm always interested in your engagement as a citizen with the place that you live in, and what kind of a reconciliation you have made to be okay with that system, and if not, what kind of resistance have you taken? But the next novel is extremely different for a number of reasons. But I should say that with this book, I did mention that I started out with this idea of exploitation, but at the same time, I don't like to know what my books are going to be about, so I like to write into the dark. Otherwise, I have almost no interest in writing. It would feel like colouring in, so that's just not how I write. So I didn't want 350 pages later to be asking the same question, so I put this really early on in the book, and the book becomes about something else. And essentially, it was a female lead because I'd written several practice novels and they were all men and they all had protagonists, so I felt that I had readied myself to write a female protagonist. And I wanted to write a kind of picaresque novel, which, is just a novel about a character out in the world. You might say like Ulysses or Voltaire's Candide, or even Frankenstein and books like that, where it's about a character doing stuff, essentially about their career or what's driving them, where the drive for the engine of the narrative doesn't come from a relationship, so it's not a love story, and it's not a coming of age engine. All of the books I loved growing up were about men out in the world doing stuff. They're, maybe novels of ideas or, just all of the novels. They don't even really have labels. They're not coming of ages primarily, and they're not love stories. And so when I started to realize that I was doing that, it occurred to me that the only picaresque novels with female leads are heroines. And they're heart of gold heroines, and the arc of those novels are always about the character discovering their inner strengths and their inner integrity, and that's where the arc of the novel comes from. And so I was writing a character who I didn't want her to be a heroine. I just wanted her to, actually I didn't know what she would be, but I wanted to allow her to be whatever she needed to be and whatever the novel wanted her to be. And it turns out that she's doesn't behave admirably. And what she's actually driven by is cynicism. And she's become extremely cynical that in order to succeed in late capitalism, what you need, first and foremost, is privilege. That's the biggest building block to success. And after privilege, you need a willingness to be morally adaptable. And this is her kind of thesis, which her father, a banker for Barclays, kind of instilled in her, and he saw her as great material, a great success story material, except that for her, that willingness to be duplicitous. And having to have privilege meant that if you are to achieve success, that's a pretty compromised and grim and uninspiring form of success. Is a good life even possible in within such an equation, or is trying to live a good life some form of self-delusion? So it's really about somebody contending with cynicism, and I don't know about how many people in the room I see a lot of millennials, and there was certainly a feeling in the last 15 years of a cynicism, an unspoken cynicism that people were trying to work out, and that there were no films about, and there were no books about, and it's not a very flattering thing to write about or to read about. But it's how we got where we are, by people not contending with the ugliness of the social structure enough, and not accepting that if you protect your privilege, it's very unlikely that your ethics are very admirable.
I was at the annual conference of the American Political Science Association there today at the Washington Hilton. This morning I was at a panel discussion on Ireland, and I had the book with me, and someone asked me, one of the political scientists asked me, from Ireland, asked me what was it about. And I said, I told them it was about, Ireland of the, the crash and all that. And they said, I can't bear the idea. It's so grim. I know it's important, but it's so grim. And I said, no, this book is not grim, because it's not grim. I don't think it's a grim thing to be having an honest... It's not grim at all. I mean, it's not... I had to correct this person and say, no, it actually comes across somehow as nearly an optimistic book.
Yeah, because, so the book...
Because Gail is not downtrodden. She's not beaten into pulp by life.
No, she's
actually up there fighting till the last pages.
She's an active character, so she's got agency, which is a privilege, but she is actively proving things to herself. And by doing that, she is not living in an apathetic, passive, submissive, reticent way. She is trying to prove something to herself. And where that leaves her, she's young when the novel finishes. So she does, in a sense...
Does this mean there's another novel about Gail coming our way?
No, but I think it's important because, for example, I hope it's not too much of a spoiler, but she has a relationship with a woman. She's bisexual in the book, and because I allowed her to not be like a likable, easy heroine, or an admirable kind of character. She, you can tell that she knows that if she chooses to be with a woman, she will be relinquishing a certain amount of her privilege. Things will be harder. Opportunities will be lost to her, and there's a choice to be made. And there are very few novels that kind of reveal those types of compromises that people can make, because it's an aspect of life. We do all have, we are all compromised. And I think I'm so wary of middle-class white women's desire to flatter themselves. And I think, that there's a reason why, apart from the race issue in America, the other reason why Hillary wasn't electable, in my view, is because there's no precedent for such a character. She was, a ruthlessly ambitious woman who doesn't have any trauma. There was a trauma, but it didn't really traumatize her. It traumatized Monica Lewinsky. And if it had traumatized Hillary more, it might have rendered her electable, because that's the type of thing we can get behind. We can get behind a wounded woman, we can get behind a heroine heart of gold woman. We cannot get behind a comparable politician. She, was clearly the qualified candidate, the better candidate. It's not my politics, by the way, hers aren't, but in that scenario, she was the person you'd vote for, right? We're in an age where we're trying to figure out why she wasn't elected. Well, where's the precedent? Where's the book about characters like that? Not heroines. Capable of the job, and there's such a double standard still existent, and I believe the biggest force of change for that will come from women, and white women specifically, because it was 54% of white women that didn't vote for Hillary. So that's something it's probably, the novel sold abysmally in America, and it's probably partly because of that, because people, that's not an easy sell, but I still think it's important.
Well, when I was reading it, I was thinking of how different it is from the, shall we say, the kind of standard Irish novel of the last century. I mean, if you think about Edna O'Brien, for example, and Country Girls, and written 50 years ago, or John McGahern, his novels about rural Ireland and the repressive, enclosed, confined society. I mean, Gail doesn't live in that kind of society at all. In fact, she's quite a privileged background, although troubled. I mean, her father's a banker, her mother is an orchestra conductor. By the way, you're very good on classical music. You managed to describe the classical music scene. Is that because you have some background, or did you have to do research in that part of the book?
There's 5 kids in my family, and we had a violin that was passed around from each kid, so we squeaked our way, and in Ireland there's very much a culture of the party piece. So,
yes.
You have lots of family gatherings, and everyone has to have a party piece. So the violin was handed round. But I've been in a lot of amateur orchestras. I find, I haven't in years, but I lived in New Zealand for 7 years, and I was part of some some really bad orchestras there, which were like the sources of such joy, like people spending their evenings, like, you know, looking forward to the biscuit break, you know, and like just the humor that of like people engaging in like something for fun, for yeah, like, so I find that especially in the amateur side of things, it just...
That's another thing I wanted to ask you about. I mean, you lived in New Zealand for 7 years, and you were an executive with Google.
Not an executive.
Well, you were.
I was an entry level.
You know, well, I mean, but you could have stayed in Google, and you could have, the share options would have come your way, and by now you'd probably be working in Silicon Valley in Google headquarters. You know.
I have 5 Google shares actually since then. I would have gotten 5 every year. I don't know if I'm supposed to reveal this. Oh well.
Oh well, you've done it anyway now, so there you are.
Yeah,
what can we say?
But anyway, but I didn't last long enough to get any more of them. I couldn't, you know.
But what made you? I mean, you could have stayed in that corporate world and gone up through the ranks and probably had a very successful career. What prompted you to sort of take the plunge and decide to become a writer? I think you told me when we spoke earlier in the week that you're earning less now than you earned in your first year at Google.
Oh, well, because I did an authors at Google talk. They don't actually really like to have fiction authors in there because, you know, the employees like to learn things. But I wangled my way in anyway into the Dublin thing, and I gave a talk. But I didn't want to, you know, be belittling. So I did, you know, tell everyone to read David Graeber's Bullshit Jobs, and you know, the fact of the matter is that I wasn't paid to be there. You know, so and then when I revealed that, you know, when I had worked at Google something like 12 or whatever years ago, I earned twice as much as I do now. There, you know, everyone was kind of looking at each other awkwardly, thinking about their health insurance, you know. But that's you know, it's important to bring it up because, you know, we only get one life. Right. And, you know, who knows how short or long it's going to be. Yes. It always is too short. And so for me, it's just, I couldn't be doing something that isn't the most important thing to be doing. Even when it comes to writing, you know, I could be a far more successful writer, like, you know, really, and but those are, for me, would be compromises because, you know, I think about it like if you were to be hit by a bus, what's the thing that you would want to be working on, and that has to be the thing. And so it's not necessarily what's going to sell or what's going to make your publicist happy, but yeah. So I'm a bit contrary, I think.
Now, as I mentioned earlier in my introduction of you, I came across you first as a poet, with your collection Gathering Evidence. When I read that, I thought, oh, this is really lively, vigorous, contemporary. When you write a novel, does it come from a different part of your being? I mean, how does because I can imagine, I tweet poetry every day, but I have never written a single line of poetry, I have to say. Sadly, I've never been able to do it, but I know a good line when I see one. Mm-hmm. And I could imagine that a line or an idea comes into your head and you go away and you put it down on the page or you type it out, and that's your poem, and you work on it, you revise it, but essentially it comes from a sort of a moment of inspiration. Is writing a novel essentially the same experience, or does it come from a different part of your being?
They're so different. Like, novels are they're so hard. It's so hard to write a novel. It's so hard, and you need to have such an amount of self-belief. So that building that up takes time. You know, it took me kind of a year or something after finishing Orchid to be able to really write anything, because I was kind of so, you know, it's so draining. It takes everything that you have, and so then, because I don't tend to, you know, describe a novel before I start writing it, I don't design it. Which, by the way, you know, if you think about it this way, I've never heard of anybody designing a poem before they write it. But it's very common to hear of someone designing a novel.
I mean, did you design your novel when you were writing it?
No. Like, I mean, even so, it goes from Dublin to London to New York, and there's a section in the Occupy Wall Street movement, and I didn't know that was going to happen. It happened just because, I mean, I didn't even know the page before. So it happened because it was like, she was going to New York, and it was October 2011, and I Googled Wikipedia, October 2011, what's going on, just in case there's some public holiday or whatever, and it's Occupy. And I think I ran down the street, you know, shouting with joy, because it felt like such serendipity. It was completely connected to but no, I really don't know at all. the project is with the novel is to try and push into and interrogate yourself the questions, the most subtle and nuanced and deep questions that you're capable of asking of the world and of yourself. So that's what you were trying to do, and I believe in a gestation period between writing. I could never go from writing one thing to another, because you just need time to rediscover, for the kind of center of gravity of your interest in the world and your thought processes to move, so that the next novel isn't some weird limb of the previous book.
Now, the Irish Times, in its review, which I mentioned earlier, said that you were part of a new guard of young writers, as they put it, marching over the hill of Irish fiction. Do you see yourself in that way as a part of a generation shaking up the old, shaking off the cobwebs of the kind of established literary order in Ireland and somehow turning it on its head and creating a new literary tradition for the 21st century?
I don't know. I don't really, when I look back at Irish writing, I don't really see any gap in there being, writers that were doing interesting things. So, I mean, maybe there are more voices because of capitalism, because of products, more products. But they happen to be of quite a high quality. I would say largely because of investment, because of Culture Ireland and the Arts Council, and that's why I'm here. And the embassy, so this is systemic support, which is privilege, right? So that's why I'm always very wary of the self-congratulation about Irish writing, because so much of that is just kind of the statistics of systemic support. Even if you compare Northern Ireland to the Republic, it's far fewer dollars per capita is spent on the arts. In Northern Ireland,
right? Yeah.
So and that shows in the kind of quantity of books from the North in comparison to ones from the Republic. Yeah. So that's just I always feel it's important.
But we do seem to have a kind of a fairly rich vein of younger writers at the moment, do we not?
Yeah, there are some really great writers, and maybe the social media age and all of that is helping some more voices that might be kind of that might fall between the cracks. I'm not sure. It does seem that it's a small island, and there is everyone's very friendly. Like the friendliness is real. I noticed that because I haven't lived in Ireland, in the Republic, since I was 16. I studied in Belfast for 5 years, and then I moved to New Zealand, and now I live in the Netherlands. And I was very wary when I started publishing that I wouldn't be let in, or that I'd never quite belong. I've never felt
you were let into my Twitter account anyway, so...
Well, I think I probably let myself in, I probably came knocking on the door. But yeah, so I mean that community of writers is very strong and very open, increasingly open to second and third generation immigrants as well in Ireland, and the more of that the better, because it's always a little bit. I was saying to somebody earlier that the Irish never do those DNA tests because it's just be horrifying. You'd be your own cousin, like it's.
Yeah, I did mine recently, and I was in Salt Lake City with Ancestry, and they said it was very rare. I was 100% Irish. There you are. I was a bit worried I might be less than 50%. It might be sort of a career-ending experience, but anyway. So I was going to ask, did you bring any of your poetry?
I did. I brought 2 poems.
Because I think it would be nice for the audience to hear your own voice, hear your poetry. Obviously, it's hard to read from the novel because but I think if you read one of your poems or a couple of your poems, I think that'd be very interesting to hear, your language, because the language of your poetry comes through in the language of the novel. At least I think that anyway. It seems to me to be coming from the same linguistic source. You don't have a different voice in prose than the one you have in poetry. I think the voices are kindred voices. Yeah.
Yeah, I write equally slowly with both.
Okay. Actually, the novel, it's very pacey. But you're saying it may be pacey in the way it reads, but it wasn't pacey in the way you wrote it.
Wrote it, no.
Okay. Anyway, give us a poem.
I'll read one called Preventive Measures, and it's a little bit of it's kind of a sci-fi poem, which is an odd idea, but it imagines a character who has had a preventative heart transplant. It's just in a slightly futuristic scenario, and she's brought her old heart in a jar to her father, who is got heart disease, and is of the generation that they are the new technologies, the new world isn't available to them. There's another parallel conversation going on between the father and daughter about legacy, and about the type of new reality that you might have to be comfortable living within. And you'll hear in the poem, it's quite short, there's a heartbeat, and as the poem progresses, it kind of starts to trip on itself. Preventive measures. Today, I wanted to show you my heart. You asked, you'd open your ribs like a book? Blood vessels broke on your cheeks, and you shook. I wanted to help you to see, to label the troublesome parts. I regret the faults I passed on, but that's the Lord's unknowable way. I've more stents now than prayers, and they serve me just fine. Father, I wanted to show you the organ I ordered online. It's the color of cider apple. It's complex as your ear, tender as stingray. You glanced at the jar stuck between us. The muscle it held was lightened. The preservant was blood-stained, like Riesling poured on the dregs of Syrah. You can wear my old heart on your sleeve. I laughed. You said, a stigma. You sat there, heart bleating, until apples in some orchard had ripened. Thank you.
So I think we have time for a couple of questions. Hands up, and somebody will appear before you with a microphone. And if we could have a question. Oh, yeah, sorry, yes.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mr. Hughes, for coming to the festival and reading the poem. You talked about your writings being influenced by what happened between 2007 and the period after that. Ireland has been going through some seismic changes in the last 10 years. You had the referendum on abortion. You have a gay prime minister. What's the title? I mean, it's an unusual title. He's not called...
Taoiseach.
Yeah,
Taoiseach.
which I have to read up on that. Is that reflective of, I mean, are your writings going to be influenced by those events? And also, are you influenced by the fact that you've been part of the European Economic Community for so many years? And of course, the inevitable question about Brexit.
Oh.
I mean, how is that going to... And I just wanted to add, I haven't read Irish literature extensively, but one of my favorite poems in school was William Butler Yeats' Lake Isle of Innisfree.
I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree. Yes, go ahead.
I loved it. I've read Oscar Wilde. I don't think I have it in me to digest James Joyce's Ulysses.
He's got a great blog on it.
Okay.
Yeah.
But anyway, I wanted to talk to you about these events and how they influence writers. And it's good that you mentioned that there's a lot of literature coming out of Northern Ireland. One doesn't hear much about it. We hear only about Ulster and all the blow-ups that happened, but it's nice that you mentioned it.
There's a very good Northern Irish novel that came out recently called The Fire Starters by Jan Carson, and it centres around the 12th of July, the Orange Order marches in Northern Ireland, that are, where you maybe see the news of those huge fires, but it's written from a loyalist perspective. And I think now is a very interesting time to allow space for loyalists in Northern Ireland who are being really delivered the worst outcome for having engaged in a peaceful coexistence with Republicans and Catholics over the last 15 years. So how to tackle your questions, because there was a few there. Well, one aspect of contemporary Irish culture that I'm very nervous about is, and this might not be an ideal selling point for the ambassador here, but is that the Irish economy now relies a lot on US corporates. So we have a 12.5% corporate tax rate. To give you a comparison, Germany's is 30% at the moment. So, and the infrastructure in Germany reflects that, that money that's available to the government. And so now in this crucial moment when Ireland is becoming all the more appealing for international companies as to have as a base, especially as a tax base. It's a very dangerous time because it makes the country susceptible to corporate control of government. And that's something that I think is terrifying. And because it's very, very, while the people are still lovely in the pub and the culture is still rich, as soon as the government shifts into that sort of neoliberal, corporatocracy area, you're losing out on all sorts of social welfare and generally a rich society, in my belief. And also at the moment, the biggest the agenda for every single country in the world should be the climate. And that's not going to be on the top of the agenda for any kind of centrist or corporately inclined government. So that's what I'm very nervous about, and I wanted to write. And this novel, I think, is starting to engage with that a bit, because Ireland has been changing so quickly. So in the 80s, there was a lot of EU investment that created the infrastructure that we have now. And when I lived in Northern Ireland, going back and forth, on the odd weekend, it was a completely different economy. Northern Ireland is still very working class. And during the boom years in the south, I remember kind of being discombobulated by how a person spent their day just kind of shopping, or like building a panic room, like they felt like cognitive dissonance was a real thing. So in a way, the crash was recalibrated the Irish cultural kind of sensibility, yeah. So there are positive things. There are really progressive and exciting things, but also. And if there's time to say it, at the moment, the US has got Irish Americans have got their ears open to what's happening with Brexit, partly, for identity reasons, but also because there's this conversation that's happening about potentially united Ireland. Now, I lived in Northern Ireland, and I can tell you that the best scenario for Northern Ireland is the status quo, which is in every other aspect of life, the status quo is the worst scenario at the moment because of the climate. But in Northern Ireland, it's a stable state, and also really importantly, it's a symbol for coexistence and tolerance and peace among people with very different backgrounds and aspirations and sensibilities. And I think that's a really hopeful thing. And so it's a disaster, Brexit, because it already has ruined the possibility of that status quo in Northern Ireland remaining. So it's a tragedy. I can keep talking about this, but maybe...
Well, I've been given the 1 minute warning, so as a good ambassador, I always take instruction from the stage manager, and as a good moderator too, I will bring things to a close. But I just wanted to thank you, Caoilinn, for coming over. The embassy is delighted to be associated with this event, with the National Book Festival, with the Library of Congress. My first week in Washington 2 years ago, one of the first things I did was to visit the Library of Congress, and it's a wonderful place. If you haven't been there, you definitely need to go. But my most exciting moment of that tour of the Library of Congress was not the great building, but rather getting into the shelves to see all the sort of shelves of books going on forever. Anyway, thank you for giving us your views on, well, thank you for talking about your novel, for reading your poetry, and also for giving us your take on contemporary Ireland and our place in the contemporary world.
And thank you. In case I don't get it, and thank you, and to the Embassy and Culture Ireland, because I wrote to Ambassador Mulhall, and I explained that my first encounter with an Irish politician was President Michael D. Higgins, who is a poet, and I met him in Galway City Library, and we were reading at the same event, bizarrely when I was 16, so my initial encounter with Irish politics was that it cared about the arts, that it participated in the arts, and that it turned up. So thank you for...
Well, you and I could talk about this book for a long time and the issues that it raises with regard to the contemporary Ireland that I'm privileged to represent here in the United States as ambassador. But thank you for coming, and thank you all for being here for this event. Thank you.